The so-called HOA cops just slapped my black wife across the face, telling her she doesn't belong here right in our own driveway. I'm a Navy SEAL. And when I saw her tears, all my training focused on one thing: breaking their faces. So I did. I broke one of their noses right there on the pavement. But as the real police hauled me away, the HOA president stood smirking behind them, laughing. She thought she had won. What she didn't know is she just declared war on someone who was trained to finish them. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, because this revenge plan is about to get surgical. And if you believe no family should ever feel unsafe in their own home because of a racist with a clipboard, hit that subscribe button. You need to see how they paid for what they did. The air in the car was warm and smelled like groceries and the faint hint of cut grass from the park we'd just left. Lisa was humming along to some song on the radio, tapping her fingers on the dashboard. It was one of those perfect, unremarkable Tuesday afternoons. We pulled into our driveway, and the garage door rumbled open. Home. That one word meant everything to me. After 20 years in the Navy, a quiet slice of suburbia with the woman I loved was the only mission I cared about anymore. I killed the engine. "I'll get the bags," I said. Lisa smiled. "I'll grab the mail." She hopped out, her bright yellow sundress a splash of sunshine against the green lawn. I watched her walk toward the curb, a sight I'd seen 1,000 times, and my heart felt full. It was the last moment of peace we'd have for a very long time. As I popped the trunk, I heard a voice. It wasn't friendly. It was sharp, cold, and full of a kind of authority someone has to invent for themselves. Two men in cheap navy blue security uniforms were standing on the sidewalk, blocking Lisa's path from the mailbox. They had on those ridiculous 8-point hats that wannabe cops wear. One of them, a thick-necked guy in his late 30s with a bitter set to his mouth, stepped right in front of her. His name tag read, Rick Daniels. "Can I help you?" Lisa asked, her voice polite but firm. Daniels looked her up and down, a nasty little smirk playing on his lips. "This is a private community," he said, his tone suggesting she couldn't possibly understand the concept. "We're asking residents to keep solicitors out." Lisa held up our mail. "I'm not a solicitor. I live here. This is my house." The second guard, a younger kid who looked like he was just playing dress-up, shifted his weight nervously. But Daniels just puffed out his chest. "I haven't seen you around here before," he said, the implication hanging thick and ugly in the air. My hand tightened on the trunk lid. This wasn't about soliciting. "Well, we've lived here for 2 years," Lisa said, her chin rising slightly. "I'm Lisa Thompson." Daniels let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Right. Look, just move along. We don't want any trouble in this neighborhood." That's when my blood ran cold. The quiet threat behind his words was unmistakable. Lisa stood her ground. "I'm not moving along. I'm going into my house." And then it happened. As she tried to step around him, Daniels put his hand on her shoulder to stop her. She pulled back, and with a lazy, almost casual motion, he swung his hand and slapped her across the cheek. It wasn't a hard hit, but the sound it made, a sharp, stinging crack, cut through the quiet afternoon like a gunshot. "You don't belong here," he snarled. I didn't run. I didn't shout. A different part of me took over, the part the military had spent years sharpening to a razor's edge. I moved with a calm, deliberate speed that felt slow in my own head, but covered the 20 feet between the car and the sidewalk in a heartbeat. The world narrowed to a single point, the bright red handprint blooming on my wife's face. I saw her eyes, wide with shock and pain, and everything else disappeared. Daniels saw me coming and tried to straighten up, to puff out his chest again and play the big man. His partner fumbled for a nightstick on his belt. They didn't stand a chance. "You put your hands on my wife," I said. My voice was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the air. Daniels sneered. She was trespassing. We're HOA security. I was no longer seeing a man in a cheap uniform. I was seeing a threat to my family. A threat that had to be neutralized. He made the mistake of taking a step toward me, raising his hand as if to shove me back. You need to calm down, buddy. My training is about de-escalation, but that only works when the other person is rational. This was pure aggression and hate. I didn't throw a punch. I didn't brawl. He reached for me, and I simply used his momentum. I sidestepped his clumsy shove, caught his arm, and twisted. As his body was forced to turn, I brought my other hand up, not in a fist, but with a flat, hard palm. I drove it straight into his nose. There was a sickening, wet crunch. It's a sound you never forget. Daniel screamed, a gurgling, high-pitched shriek, and stumbled backward, clutching his face as dark blood poured through his fingers. He crumpled to the ground, sobbing. His partner froze, his hand still on his nightstick, his face a mask of pale terror. He looked from his boss on the ground to me, and I just stared at him. I didn't say a word. He took a slow step back, then another. He was smart enough not to try anything. I turned my back on them and went straight to Lisa, gently cupping her face in my hands. Are you okay? Did he hurt you anywhere else? She was trembling, but she met my eyes, her own filled with a fiery strength that always amazed me. I'm okay, Jack. I'm okay. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Curtains twitched in the house across the street. A neighbor who'd been watering his lawn suddenly found an urgent reason to go inside, pulling his hose behind him. We were on our own. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. The younger guard had obviously called it in. And just as the first police car screeched to a halt at the curb, a silver sedan pulled up, and a woman I recognized all too well stepped out. Annabelle Granger, the HOA president. Her face was a mask of practiced outrage. She ran right past us, ignoring Lisa completely, and knelt beside the blubbering security guard. Oh my God, Rick! What did he do to you? Two police officers got out of their cruiser, their hands near their holsters. They saw exactly what Anne wanted them to see. Two men in official-looking uniforms, one of them bleeding all over the grass, and me, the big guy standing there without a scratch on him. Sir, put your hands behind your back, the first officer said, his voice flat and authoritative. I tried to explain. That man assaulted my wife. I was defending her. Anne stood up, pointing a trembling finger at me. He's lying. He attacked my security team without any provocation. He's a violent menace. The cops weren't listening to me. They were looking at Rick's bloody face and the badges on his uniform. They slapped the cold steel of the handcuffs on my wrists, the metal biting into my skin. As they led me to the cruiser, I locked eyes with Lisa. Her face was still marked with that red print, a badge of injustice. Behind the cops, I saw Anne Granger's face. For just a second, her look of feigned concern dropped, and I saw what was underneath. A triumphant, ugly smirk. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd put the new guy in his place. Sitting in the back of that police car, the cage separating me from the world, I felt the rage inside me cool down and harden into something else. It wasn't hot anymore. It was cold, heavy, and clear as ice. This wasn't over. This wasn't a fight about a slap or a broken nose. She had come into my home, hurt my family, and used the system to cover her tracks. She had no idea who she had just picked a fight with. The interrogation room smelled like stale coffee and bleach. I sat there for 3 hours while they took pictures, ran my prints, and listened to Anne Granger's Oscar-worthy performance on a scratchy recording. They left me alone with my thoughts, which were all about Lisa. Was she okay? Was she scared? The anger from the driveway had settled into a low, cold burn in my gut. Finally, a detective who looked like he'd seen it all twice came in and dropped a thin folder on the metal table. He wasn't hostile, just tired. Jack Thompson, he said, reading my file. 20 years, Navy SEALs. Impressive. He looked up at me, his eyes weighing me. My guys also took a statement from your wife, and they took pictures of her cheek. The handprint matches the one part of Mr. Daniels' hand that isn't broken. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. So here's the deal. We're not pressing charges. It's a messy situation. And frankly, a halfway decent lawyer would paint this as a clear self-defense case. But I'm giving you a warning, not a pass. Stay away from them. No contact. You have a problem, you call us. Let the system handle it. He slid the file back into his briefcase. You're free to go. Walking out of that station felt less like freedom and more like walking onto a different kind of battlefield. The system hadn't worked. It had just washed its hands of the problem. When I got home, the house was quiet. Lisa met me at the door and wrapped her arms around me, holding on tight. The red mark on her cheek had faded to a dull, angry purple. We didn't say much for a while. There was nothing to say. I had protected her, but I had failed to keep her safe. The two things felt impossibly different. That night, any hope I had that things would go back to normal was crushed. A friend texted me a link to our neighborhood's private Facebook page. Anne Granger had already launched her attack. Her post was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive poison. It started with a deeply disturbing incident in our peaceful community today, and went on to describe an unprovoked and shockingly violent assault on her dedicated security staff by a new resident with a history of combat training. She never used my name, but everyone knew. She talked about fear, about the safety of children, about the need for neighbors to look out for unstable individuals. The comments underneath were a mix of horror and support for Anne. A few people timidly suggested waiting for the full story, but they were quickly shouted down. Anne had painted me as a monster, and our neighbors were either buying it or too afraid to speak up. The next few days were a quiet kind of hell. Anne's little security force was back, and they were emboldened. Rick Daniels was on leave, probably milking his broken nose for all the sympathy it was worth, but his partner and another thug were on constant patrol. They didn't do anything illegal, they just made their presence known. A navy blue sedan would be parked across the street from our house for hours at a time, just sitting there. When Lisa went to her car, one of them would get out and slowly write something on a clipboard, never taking his eyes off her. One afternoon, she was in the front yard tending to her rose bushes. Daniels, his nose covered in a huge white bandage, drove by slowly, stopped, and just stared at her from his car window with a hateful smirk before driving off. It was a threat without a single word spoken. Lisa was strong, but I could see the toll it was taking. She started keeping the blinds closed. She stopped going for her morning walks. Our home, our sanctuary, was starting to feel like a prison. I did what the detective said. I tried to use the system. I found a lawyer, a guy who specialized in HOA disputes. He listened to my story, looked at the photos of Lisa's face, and then gave me the bad news. It's a he said, she said situation, Jack, he explained. They'll say you were the aggressor. You have no witnesses who are willing to come forward. It could take months, cost you tens of thousands of dollars, and in the end, a judge might just tell you all to play nice. Next, I tried going directly to the source. I found the date for the monthly HOA board meeting and went expecting some kind of reasonable discussion. The meeting was held in a stuffy community center library. Anne Granger sat at the head of a long table, flanked by 4 other board members, who looked about as comfortable as hostages. When the floor was opened for public comment, I stood up and laid out the facts calmly and clearly. I talked about the unprovoked assault on my wife and the subsequent campaign of intimidation. Anne let me finish, a patient little smile on her face. When I was done, she looked at her papers and said, in a voice dripping with condescension, "Thank you for your feedback. However, personnel matters are not discussed in public forum. If you have a formal complaint, you'll need to submit it in writing through the proper channels." Another board member, a woman named Susan, looked like she wanted to say something, but a sharp glance from Anne silenced her. I was stonewalled. The system wasn't broken. It was a fortress, and Anne was standing on top of the wall, laughing at me. I came home that night feeling a kind of despair I hadn't felt since I was a scared kid in boot camp. All my training, all my skills, they were useless against this. You can't fight a binder full of bylaws. You can't neutralize a smear campaign with tactical maneuvers. Lisa and I sat at the kitchen table, the lawyer's business card, and a stack of HOA violation notices Anne had started sending us for grass that was a quarter-inch too high, for a garbage can left out 10 minutes too long piled between us. Maybe we should just move, I said quietly, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Lisa reached across the table and put her hand on mine. Her eyes were tired, but the fire in them was back. No, she said, her voice shaking but firm. This is our home. We built a life here. I'm not letting that woman and her goons chase us out. She squeezed my hand. You've faced down real enemies, Jack. She's just a bully with a title. Looking at her, at the quiet strength that had gotten us through so many deployments and lonely nights, I felt my own resolve harden. The anger came back, but this time, it was different. It was focused. I had been playing her game. The nice guy, the reasonable neighbor, the man who follows the rules. But the rules were rigged. The game was fixed. Anne Granger wanted a war of paperwork and whispers and veiled threats. Fine. I had been trying to win a battle. It was time to win the war. I wasn't just going to fight her. I was going to dismantle her entire crooked kingdom, piece by piece. The annual community barbecue was supposed to be a step toward normalcy. Lisa had insisted we go. We can't hide in our own house, Jack, she'd said. We have to live our lives. So, we went. The event was held at the small park by the community lake, a patch of green surrounded by oak trees. Kids were chasing each other with water guns, and the air was thick with the smell of charcoal and sunscreen. For an hour, it almost felt like we were just another family in the neighborhood. We found a spot at a picnic table, and Lisa set down the large bowl of her famous potato salad. A few neighbors gave us small, nervous smiles. Others looked away quickly when we met their eyes. The whole community was holding its breath, and we were the reason why. I saw them before they saw us. Not Rick Daniels, with his bandaged nose, but two others from Anne Granger's collection of wannabe stormtroopers. One was the young, nervous kid from the first day, but he'd replaced his fear with a nasty swagger. The other was new, a bigger guy with a shaved head and a jaw that looked like he chewed rocks for fun. They were making the rounds, checking coolers, and enforcing some new rule about bringing outside drinks. They were looking for an excuse, and then they found us. They walked right up to our table, deliberately blocking the sundae. The big one, whose name tag read Mike, pointed a thick finger at Lisa's potato salad. "Ma'am, you're going to have to take that back to your car." Lisa looked up, confused. "Excuse me? This is a community potluck." Mike puffed out his chest. "New rule from the board. To ensure food safety, all dishes must be prepared by our licensed and approved vendor." He gestured vaguely toward a hot dog cart that was charging $8 for a shriveled frankfurter. This was it. This was the provocation. It was so petty, so stupid, that it was perfect. I stood up slowly, placing myself between them and my wife. "Guys, it's potato salad. Let it go." Mike turned his attention to me, a smirk on his face. He knew who I was. "Oh look, it's the neighborhood hero, the big bad Navy SEAL." He took a step closer, getting right in my personal space. "You have a problem with the rules?" The music from the portable speaker seemed to fade. The laughter of the children died down. Everyone was watching. I kept my hands open, and at my sides. "I have a problem with you harassing my wife over a picnic dish," I said, my voice low and steady. "Now back off and let us enjoy the day." That's when he shoved me. It wasn't a hard shove, just a chest bump meant to assert dominance, to force a reaction. I stumbled back a step, just as he intended. His partner, the younger kid, moved to my side, trying to flank me. This was a setup. Plain and simple. They wanted a show. "What are you gonna do now, tough guy?" Mike sneered, his face inches from mine. He smelled like cheap aftershave and cigarettes. I knew what would happen if I threw a punch. I'd be the aggressor. Again. I'd be in jail before I hit the ground. Anne would win. So I stood there and took it. I put my hands up, palms out. "We're done here," I said. But he wasn't done. He swung. It was a sloppy, telegraphed right hook that I saw coming a mile away. I leaned back, letting the punch sail past my face. But his momentum carried him forward, and he stumbled into me. His partner grabbed my arm from behind. I reacted on pure instinct. It wasn't a thought, it was a reflex, honed by years of training. I spun with the grab, using the kid's own pull to throw him off balance. He went stumbling sideways into the picnic table, scattering paper plates. Now it was just me and Mike. He recovered his balance and came at me again, his face purple with rage. This time he threw a wild haymaker. I blocked it with my forearm, the impact jarring but manageable. He was all brute force, no technique. I had one chance to end this, and only one. As he drew back his arm for another swing, I stepped inside his reach. It wasn't about hitting him. It was about shutting him down. As his arm came forward, I brought my left hand up to deflect it and drove my right fist, not at his face, but directly into the side of his jaw. It wasn't a brawl. It was a single, precise, and controlled strike. There was a dry, cracking sound, like a thick branch snapping. It was louder than I expected. Mike's eyes went wide with a kind of blank surprise, and his legs just gave out. He collapsed in a heap on the grass, silent. He didn't even moan. The whole thing took maybe 3 seconds. The park was dead quiet. The kid who had grabbed me was frozen by the table, staring at his boss on the ground. Every neighbor was standing still, their mouths open. Some of them had their phones out. I turned and saw a teenager about 20 yards away, his phone held up, recording everything. And then, right on cue, Anne Granger came marching through the crowd, her face a perfect picture of theatrical horror. "He did it again! Someone call 911! He's out of control!" But this time, her performance didn't quite land. The silence from the crowd wasn't fear of me. It was something else. They had all seen it. They had seen the shove. They had seen the first punch thrown. They had seen me defend myself. The police came, of course. Statements were taken. But this time, there were a dozen witnesses. And one very clear video. I wasn't arrested. Not yet. But the detective pulled me aside, his face grim. "Mr. Thompson, you're on thin ice. They're going to file assault charges. That video helps you. But a good prosecutor could still make a case that you used excessive force." The weight of that threat settled on me as we drove home. I might have been in the right, but that didn't mean I would win. The legal system is a meat grinder. It can chew up the innocent just as easily as the guilty. Later that night, the video went viral on the local town news page. The comment section was a war zone. Half the town called me a violent thug who needed to be locked up. The other half called me a hero who stood up to bullies. Our quiet little suburb had picked its sides. I sat in my darkened living room, the glow of the laptop screen lighting up my face, reading comments from people who wanted to see me in jail. The walls were closing in. I could lose my home, my savings, my freedom. For a moment, I felt the cold grip of failure. Lisa came and sat next to me, placing her hand on my shoulder. She wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at me. "They wanted this fight, Jack," she said, her voice filled with a calm, steely resolve. "They poked and they prodded until you had no choice. But now, the fighting is over." I looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" She gave me a small, determined smile. "No more fists. No more reacting. From now on, we fight on our terms. We use our heads. It's time to stop defending our home and start taking back our neighborhood." Lisa's words that night changed the mission. For weeks, I had been on defense, reacting to every jab and shove Anne Granger and her thugs threw at us. My training had always been about meeting a threat with a controlled, overwhelming response. But this wasn't a firefight. It was a siege. And you don't win a siege by running out to meet the enemy on their terms. You win by cutting off their supply lines, dismantling their command structure, and turning their own fortress into a trap. The next morning, I was up before dawn, sitting at the kitchen table with a fresh legal pad and a hot cup of black coffee. The emotional storm had passed. In its place was a quiet, cold clarity. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was an operator, and this neighborhood was my area of operations. Anne Granger was the target. The first call I made wasn't to the lawyer who told me to roll over. It was to Marcus Reynolds. Mark and I had served together for a decade. He'd taken a piece of shrapnel in his leg that ended his career in the teams, so he'd gone to law school on the GI Bill. He wasn't some polished corporate attorney. He was a grinder, a guy who knew how to find the weak point in any defense. I sent him the video from the barbecue. He called me back in 10 minutes. "Jack," he said, his voice a low growl. "They threw the first shove, the first punch, and they outnumbered you 2-1. This isn't just self-defense. This is a textbook example of it. Who are these clowns?" That was all I needed to hear. Mark agreed to take my case. He didn't promise an easy fight, but he promised a real one. He immediately started a quiet canvass of the neighborhood, tracking down the people who had recorded the incident and getting sworn statements from the few who were brave enough to talk. He was building a legal firewall around me, one brick at a time. Next, I focused on the security cops. Their power wasn't real, it was a costume. It was an illusion Anne Granger used to project authority. I needed to break that illusion. I knew just the guy. Frank Miller was a retired master electrician who had spent 40 years navigating the tangled mess of city codes, permits, and state licensing boards. He lived 3 blocks over, a gruff old Vietnam vet who spent most of his days in his garage workshop. I showed up at his door with a 6-pack of his favorite beer and the HOA's contract with the security company which I'd requested as a homeowner. Frank put on his reading glasses and spread the thin document out on his workbench. He read it in silence for 20 minutes, his only comment an occasional grunt. Finally, he took off his glasses and looked at me over the top of the papers. "Well, Jack," he said with a grim smile, "this ain't worth the paper it's printed on." He pointed a thick, calloused finger at a line in the contract. "This company, Oak Ridge Security Services, is registered as a private patrol operator, but according to the state database, their license expired 6 months ago." He tapped another section. "And their uniforms. The state has very clear rules. You can't have a uniform that could be easily mistaken for law enforcement. Badges on the chest, 8-point hats, that's a direct violation. These guys aren't just unlicensed, they're illegal." That was it. That was the crack in the foundation. Anne wasn't just hiring security. She was employing a squad of illegal impersonators to intimidate residents. While Frank was digging into the legal code and Mark was building my defense, something else started to happen. The video had drawn a line in the sand, and people were starting to quietly choose a side. An elderly woman who lived down the street stopped me while I was getting the mail. She whispered that Anne had fined her $1,000 for having a garden gnome that was 2 inches too tall. A young couple told Lisa in the grocery store that they'd been threatened with a lien on their house because their son's basketball hoop was the wrong color. The stories started trickling in, a steady stream of petty abuses and power trips. Each one was a small injustice on its own, but together they painted a picture of a community being held hostage. One of the most surprising calls came from Susan Caldwell, the board member who had stayed silent at the meeting. She called me from a blocked number, her voice nervous. She explained that she'd wanted to speak up but was afraid of Anne. Anne ruled the board through fear, threatening to dig up dirt on anyone who crossed her. Susan was tired of it. She couldn't openly defy Anne, but she could feed me information. She told me about the HOA's finances, about how Anne was using community funds to pay her illegal security force an exorbitant amount of money. All this information was great ammunition, but it still wasn't the weapon I needed to win. As long as Anne held the presidency, she could spin, deny, and bury us in paperwork. That's when Mark, my lawyer, found the kill shot. We were reviewing the HOA bylaws, a document so dense and boring it could be used as a sleep aid. But buried deep in Section 9 was an article about voting rights. Every household had one vote. But the article also allowed for proxy voting. A homeowner could sign over their voting rights to another resident to cast on their behalf. The bylaws were written decades ago, when most homeowners lived in their houses. Now, a quick check of the county property records showed that nearly 30% of the homes in our development were rentals, owned by out-of-state investment groups or people who had inherited the property. These owners didn't care about the color of a basketball hoop. They cared about the bottom line. And a community with pending lawsuits, illegal security forces, and a president who assaulted residents was very, very bad for the bottom line. A plan formed in my mind, cold and precise. It was a classic flanking maneuver. Anne was watching the front door, expecting a direct assault through the courts. She had no idea I was about to come through the back wall. I started making phone calls. I spent hours tracking down the absentee landlords, the investment managers, the families who lived 1,000 miles away. I didn't talk about my personal fight. I talked about liability. I talked about property values. I sent them the news articles, the video, the stories from other residents. I explained that the current leadership was putting their investment at risk. And then I made them an offer. Give me your proxy. Let me be your voice. Let me go to the next meeting and vote to restore sanity and protect your asset. One by one, the signed proxy forms started coming in, scanned and emailed to Mark's office. Hope was no longer a feeling. It was a strategy. Anne was busy orchestrating her smear campaign, feeling secure on her throne. She had no idea that I was quietly buying up the shares of her little kingdom, not with money, but with something far more powerful: the trust of her neglected constituents. The final showdown wasn't going to be in a courtroom or a park. It was going to be in that stuffy community center library. And this time, I wouldn't be there to complain. I would be there to take over. Using the stack of proxies I had collected, I invoked a clause in the HOA bylaws that allowed a certain percentage of homeowners to call for an emergency meeting. Anne Granger had no choice but to schedule it. She probably thought I was going to make another futile speech, another plea for fairness. She had no idea I was coming to her meeting with an army. We made sure everyone knew about it. Lisa worked the neighborhood moms text chains. Frank put up flyers in the local hardware store. I even called the local news station's investigative reporter and told him there might be a story about HOA corruption worth covering. When the night of the meeting arrived, the community center library wasn't just full, it was overflowing. People were standing in the back, spilling out into the hallway. The air was buzzing with a nervous energy, a feeling that something was about to break. A local news cameraman was setting up in the corner. This wasn't going to be another closed-door proceeding. This was going to be a public execution. Anne and her board sat at the front table, looking flustered by the massive turnout. She banged a small wooden gavel. "This emergency meeting has been called by Mr. Jack Thompson," she said, her voice tight with annoyance. "Mr. Thompson, you have 5 minutes to state your purpose." She looked at her watch pointedly, a little power play to show everyone who was in charge. I didn't go to the public podium. I walked right up to the front table, carrying a thick binder, and stood next to her. My lawyer Mark stood a few feet behind me, a silent, imposing presence. "Anne, my purpose tonight isn't to talk," I said, my voice calm but loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "It's to take action. According to Article 12 of the bylaws, a motion can be brought to a vote to remove any and all board members for cause." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Anne's face paled slightly. That's absurd. There is no cause. Isn't there? I asked. I opened the binder. Let's talk about the security company you have on the payroll. Oak Ridge Security Services. Exhibit A. I slid a document across the table to her. This is a printout from the state licensing board, showing their license expired 6 months ago. You have been using homeowner dues to fund an unlicensed, illegal operation. Her eyes darted from the paper to the crowd, her composure beginning to crack. That's a clerical error. Is it also a clerical error? I continued, my voice getting harder. That their uniforms are in direct violation of state regulations, designed to prevent impersonating law enforcement? That's a criminal offense, Anne. Not for them. For you. For knowingly employing them. I looked out at the audience. How many of you have been stopped, questioned, or intimidated by these men? A dozen hands shot up, then 2 dozen. Anne tried to bang her gavel again. This is out of order. And then there's the matter of the assaults, I said, my voice dropping. The room went silent. I turned to Mark. He stepped forward. For the record, Mark said, his lawyerly voice cutting through the tension, my client, Jack Thompson, has been the victim of 2 unprovoked physical attacks by employees of the HOA. We have over 15 sworn witness statements and crystal-clear video evidence to corroborate that in both incidents, he was acting in self-defense. Any attempt to press charges against him will be met with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against this board and you, Mrs. Granger, personally, for negligent hiring and targeted harassment. Anne stared at him, speechless. The crowd was eating it up. The news camera was pointed directly at her crumbling facade. Now came the final blow. But we're not here to sue you, Anne, I said. We're here to fire you. I'd like to call for a vote. A vote of no confidence in the entire sitting board. She finally found her voice. A shrill, desperate shriek. You can't do that. You don't have the votes. Don't I? I said. I placed my hand on a thick stack of papers at the bottom of my binder. I hold in my hand signed notarized proxy votes from 67 absentee homeowners, representing nearly a third of this community. When you add those to the residents in this room who are tired of being bullied, I trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Her face went from white to a blotchy, furious red. She looked out at the crowd, at her neighbors, and for the first time, she saw that they weren't on her side. They were looking at her with contempt. You people are ungrateful, she screeched, standing up so fast her chair nearly tipped over. I have worked thanklessly to maintain the standards of this community, to protect your property values. And this is the thanks I get? You let this violent thug come in here and destroy everything. Her eyes locked on mine, filled with pure, undiluted hatred. He's a liar. He attacked my people. He's the monster, not me. And that's when I signaled the cameraman. My friend Frank, the electrician, was standing by a small projector he had set up earlier. He hit a button on a remote. The lights in the library dimmed, and the big white wall behind Anne's head flickered to life. It was the video from the barbecue. The entire room watched in silence as the footage played out on a 10-foot screen. They saw the HOA goon, Mike, shove me. They saw him throw the first punch, and then they saw my single, decisive response. There was no sound, but none was needed. The truth was there, in high definition, for everyone to see. When the clip ended, the lights came back up. Anne was just standing there, frozen, humiliated, her own lies playing out on the wall behind her like a monument to her downfall. The silence in the room was absolute, a crushing weight of judgment. No one was looking at me anymore. Every single eye in that room was on her. She had lost. It was over. Her power, built on whispers and fear, had just been publicly demolished by undeniable proof. The drive home from the meeting was the quietest it had been in weeks. There was no celebration, no high fives. Lisa and I just sat in the car, the streetlight sliding over the windshield, the feeling in the air not one of triumph, but of immense, bone-deep relief. It felt like the fever had finally broken. When Anne had been exposed like that, standing frozen in the projector light, the fight had just ended. The vote was a landslide. The entire board was removed. An interim board, led by a retired accountant everyone trusted, was put in place. Anne had just gathered her purse and walked out of the room without another word, her face a blank mask of shock and fury. She didn't look at anyone. The news story that aired the next night sealed it. It showed clips of the meeting, the video of the fight, and interviews with neighbors who finally felt safe enough to tell their stories of fines and harassment. Anne Granger was no longer just a neighborhood problem. She was a public spectacle. In the days that followed, it was like the whole neighborhood could finally exhale. People started talking to each other again. Neighbors who had avoided my gaze now gave me a thumbs up when I drove by. Frank Miller came over and we shared that 6-pack of beer on my back porch. Susan Caldwell even stopped by to apologize for not speaking up sooner. The security cars were gone. The intimidation was gone. It felt like we had our home back. I should have known it was too easy. A cornered animal is the most dangerous kind, and I had cornered Anne in front of the whole world. I'd taken away her power, her status, her entire identity. A person like that doesn't just pack up and move away. They lash out one last time. It happened 2 nights later, just after midnight. The house was dark and quiet. Lisa was asleep beside me. I was on the edge of sleep myself when I was jolted awake by a sudden, complete silence. The low hum of the air conditioner was gone. The soft glow of the alarm clock on the nightstand was dark. The power was out. My first thought wasn't a tripped breaker. My first thought was, they're here. All the instincts that had been dormant for a few days came roaring back to life. I slipped out of bed, moving silently across the floor. I grabbed the heavy-duty mag light I keep in the nightstand, its beam a tight, bright circle. I didn't turn on any lights. I went to the window and peered through the blinds. There was no storm, no wind. The streetlights were on. It was just our house, a black hole of darkness on an otherwise normal street. My breaker box is on the outside wall of the house, near the garage. Anyone could access it. I told Lisa to stay in the bedroom and call 911 if she heard anything. Then I slipped on a pair of shoes and went out the back door, circling around the house through the yard, keeping to the shadows. The mag light was off. I knew my property better than anyone. I could navigate it by the faint moonlight. As I rounded the corner of the garage, I heard a sound, a sharp, metallic snip, then a muffled curse. I crouched behind the big azalea bushes that bordered the driveway. From there, I had a clear view of the side of my house. And I saw them, 2 figures, bathed in the weak light of a single cell phone flashlight. One was Anne Granger. She was holding the phone, directing the light onto the open breaker box. The other figure was Rick Daniels, his nose still crooked from our first encounter. He was holding a pair of heavy wire cutters, and he was systematically snipping through the main power lines leading into my home. This wasn't just flipping a switch. This was vandalism. This was a felony. They were trying to cripple us, to cause thousands of dollars in damage, to make one final, destructive point. My blood ran cold, but the rage was gone. All I felt was a kind of grim satisfaction. This was the mistake I had been waiting for. I didn't shout, I didn't confront them. I stayed perfectly still in the shadows, pulled out my own phone, and dialed 911. I spoke in a low whisper, telling the dispatcher my address, that there were 2 individuals actively destroying my property, and that one of them had a history of violence. I told them to come without sirens. I watched for 5 more minutes as Daniels finished his work, snipping the last wire with a grunt of effort. The phone light went out. "Let's go," Anne whispered, her voice a venomous hiss. They started to walk back toward the street, toward her car parked a few houses down. They thought they had gotten away with it. They were halfway down my driveway when 2 police cruisers, moving with no lights and no sound, turned onto our street and silently blocked the exit. As Anne and Rick reached the sidewalk, The cruiser's headlights and spotlights flashed on, bathing them in blinding white light. An officer's voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "Police, stop right there! Put your hands in the air!" Anne shrieked, a sound of pure panic. Rick froze like a deer in the headlights. The wire cutters still clutched in his hand. He dropped them with a loud clatter on the concrete. The arrest was fast and efficient. This time, there was no confusion, no he said, she said. There were 2 vandals, caught in the act, on my property, with the tools of the crime in their hands. As the officers cuffed Anne, her pathetic final act of defiance was to scream at me, "You did this! You ruin everything!" The officer calmly told her she had the right to remain silent, and I watched them place her in the back of a police car, the same way they had done to me weeks before. The justice of it was almost poetic. The next day, Mark called. The district attorney's office had reviewed everything. The initial assault on my wife, the fight at the barbecue, and now the felony vandalism. They were throwing the book at Anne and her thugs. Assault, conspiracy, illegal impersonation of an officer for the fake security force, and felony destruction of property. And then Mark gave me the final piece of news. "Jack," he said, "the DA is officially declining to press any charges against you. The file is closed. It's been ruled as clear-cut self-defense. You're completely in the clear." A weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying lifted off my shoulders. It was over. Truly, finally, over. The fight was won. The war was won. That night, Lisa and I sat in our living room, the power restored by an emergency electrician. The house was quiet again. But this time, it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of fear or tension. It was the silence of peace. We were safe. Our home was ours again. And the woman who tried to break us was sitting in a jail cell, her petty kingdom of rules and hate dismantled for good. In the aftermath of Anne's spectacular downfall, I found myself in a position I never wanted or expected. At the first meeting of the new interim HOA board, they asked me to take the president's seat. I almost laughed. After everything I had gone through to dismantle the old power structure, the last thing I wanted was to sit at the head of that table. But then I looked around the room. I saw Frank Miller, who had agreed to serve as treasurer. I saw Susan Caldwell, her face no longer filled with fear, but with a quiet determination, sitting as the new secretary. I saw the faces of my neighbors, looking at me not as a violent outsider, but as someone who had stood up when no one else would. I realized that tearing something down is only half the job. You have to build something better in its place. So I accepted, on one condition. My term would be temporary, and our first and only mission was to rewrite the rules, to make sure what happened to my family could never happen to anyone else, ever again. Our meetings weren't about the color of someone's mailbox or the height of their lawn. We went through the HOA bylaws with a red pen, line by line. The first thing to go was the entire section on private security. We made it illegal for the HOA to hire any company that patrolled the neighborhood or confronted residents. Security was for the community pool and the clubhouse, period. If there was a real problem, you called the real police. It was that simple. Next, we tackled the fine system. We wrote in new rules that required a 2/3 majority vote from the board to issue any fine over $50. We created a clear and simple appeals process, judged by a committee of homeowners, not just the board. The era of a single person wielding the power to threaten a family's finances over a garden gnome was over. Frank, with his decades of practical knowledge, helped us draft simple, common-sense guidelines for property maintenance that were easy to understand and follow. No more pages of complicated jargon designed to trap people. The biggest change we made was adding a new anti-discrimination and anti-harassment clause to the very beginning of the bylaws. It stated plainly that no homeowner could be targeted, intimidated, or treated differently based on their race, religion, or any other personal characteristic. It had real teeth, too. Any board member found to be in violation would be immediately and permanently removed from their position. While we were fixing the rules, the legal system was taking care of the wreckage Anne had left behind. Facing a mountain of evidence and the threat of a massive civil suit from us, the HOA's insurance company settled out of court. A significant portion of that settlement was paid directly to Lisa, not for the slap itself, but for the trauma and targeted intimidation she endured. It wasn't about the money. It was about acknowledgement. It was a formal, legal document that said, "What they did to you was wrong." Anne Granger and her goons pleaded guilty to lesser charges to avoid a long jail sentence. They got probation, heavy fines, and were ordered to pay restitution for the damages to our home. Anne sold her house and moved away before the ink was dry on the plea deal. Her reign was over, and she was wiped from the community like a bad stain. About a month later, on a warm Saturday afternoon, the new board hosted an event. It wasn't called a barbecue or a potluck. We just called it a neighborhood get-together. It was held in the same park by the lake where I'd had the final fight. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. The tension was gone, replaced by a relaxed and easy sense of community. Kids ran around, their laughter echoing across the water. Neighbors who had once been afraid to make eye contact were now sharing food and conversation. Lisa brought her potato salad, and this time, nobody said a word about it. I stood by the grill, flipping burgers, and watched her laughing with a group of other women from the neighborhood. She looked lighter, freer. The shadow that had been hanging over her for so long was finally gone. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Frank tapped a microphone. "I just want to say something," he said, his gruff voice carrying over the crowd. "A lot has changed in our neighborhood recently. We all went through something ugly, but we came out of it stronger, because people decided to stand together." He looked over at me, and then at Lisa. "And because one family refused to back down." He then pointed to the small wooden sign by the path leading to the water. The old, faded sign had simply said, "Community Lake." Now a new, freshly carved sign stood in its place. It read, "Lisa's Point." The whole neighborhood broke into applause. My wife's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't tears of pain or fear. They were tears of gratitude. I walked over and put my arm around her as she watched the sun set over the water, her water. That was true justice. It wasn't about a broken nose or a public humiliation. It was about this. It was about reclaiming a sense of safety, restoring fairness, and building a community where people look out for each other instead of looking for reasons to tear each other down. I had come to this neighborhood looking for peace, and instead, I found a war. But in fighting that war, and in winning it, I'd found something more valuable. I found a community worth fighting for. Our home was finally, truly, our sanctuary. And for the first time in a long time, the future felt secure, not just for us, but for everyone who called this place home.